Hello, hello. I'm Rachel Bierman.
I'm Misha Meyer.
And this is Cue the Lights. We're here today with Leticia Fraga, Councilwoman to the Princeton Council and Liaison to the Princeton Civil Rights Commission, which Tommy Parker is the chairperson of.
Thank you for inviting us.
Well, thank you for coming on our show, and we're going to start off with the first question, which...
So you wish to, since New Jersey doesn't have Columbus Day, well, doesn't celebrate Columbus Day, you wish to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, since Columbus and the rest of the conquistadors and pilgrims unfortunately committed mass genocide on them, and so we could celebrate the Indigenous people instead. So how did you and the Civil Rights Commission come up with this?
Well, I can tell you just from, and I want to, from the beginning, I want to make the statement that even though I serve on council and liaison to the Civil Rights Commission, that I'm here, I'm not representing council or the Civil Rights Commission. I'm here to speak and express my own opinions. Mm-hmm. So speaking of expressing my own opinions, just going back to where I grew up in Washington State, and where I lived, the whole state basically is a celebration of the people that came before us. The names, the school that I went to was Kennewick High, which means grassy land in Native language. Also near Walla Walla, Washington. I always like saying Walla Walla, Washington. That's also Native land. And then before coming to Princeton, I lived in Seattle. So Seattle was named after chief of the Nisquamish tribes. So it's been, for me, coming to Princeton, where it wasn't very visible that it was being acknowledged. It was already of interest to me to explore having Princeton celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. So not necessarily, I know some communities specifically did it as a means to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, but for me personally, it's more of acknowledging the people who were here before us.
No, absolutely. I'd have to say the same thing. This mission is a mission that I've taken on personally, and as much as understanding those who came before us and paying homage to that, and also to say that even in my work as a commissioner, this is a project that is a community-wide project, so therefore I'm not speaking on behalf of the commission per se. We're in fact about to engage in a meeting among some folks in the community who have expressed an interest in this, and do some research and therefore come forward, make some recommendations that'll go back to the Civil Rights Commission, and in the process of how we do things, all right, then that would then be presented to the town via the council meeting.
So did the commission face any obstacles in creating this event or this?
So not at all. Actually, when it first came to the attention of council, it was through public comment during council meeting. Several people came to speak before council actually last October to express, to advocate for Princeton acknowledging and celebrating Indigenous people. And so it started there, but then at the beginning of this year, every year, council, before the year starts, they get together to in a retreat to discuss goals and initiatives that we each want to work on. And knowing that I would be a liaison to the Civil Rights Commission, I had already, because I already had a personal interest in it, I took it on as one of my goals that I wanted to work on this year, is to work on an initiative to establish Indigenous Peoples Day. And so, so far, people who knew that I was going to be working on that have approached me, one, to express encouragement and support for it, but two, asking how they can be involved. Personally, I have not seen any resistance to it at all. Not even from our Italian American community, I should say, including one of the first individuals that came to speak before council. He's of Italian American heritage, and he expressed the desire for Princeton to acknowledge and celebrate Indigenous people.
And so what are some ways that the Princeton community can help show their support or further encourage this implementation?
Well, for one, I would say when it comes, right now the committee will be, there's a subcommittee of the Civil Rights Commission who has been tasked with doing research on what other communities have done and coming up with ideas and draft language on what should go into a resolution to present to council. So then when it's presented to council, definitely that's when I would encourage individuals who would support such a resolution to come and speak if they're in favor for it. But also it's important to hear even if all opinions. So even if there are others who maybe perhaps are not in favor of it, we want to hear from them as well. And so that whatever concerns they may have, we can address them.
And we have actually, I mean, to Leticia's point, we also, in our goal setting announcements made at the beginning of the year, this was an absolute project that we were going to be working on, due in part not only to what had been presented to council sometime earlier, right, but there are a number of citizens and or groups that are organized to do research and find out what it would take to develop the acknowledgement, how extensive the acknowledgement should be, and then incorporating Princeton's relative history into this process. And quite honestly, haven't seen any resistance at all. Like I said, I think it's an idea whose time is coming and come again. So it's been an ongoing conversation.
That's wonderful to hear. That's honestly great. Do you mind giving us your definition of Indigenous peoples, just for the viewers to clarify exactly who and what and the history that we'd be celebrating?
Well, for me, Indigenous people would be the inhabitants of the land, the first inhabitants of this land. And it's not just here in the U.S., it's also other countries, right. Including, on a personal note, I recently did my genealogy, ancestry DNA, and I shouldn't be surprised, but because I think all of us, most of us, I should say, have some percentage of indigenous background. But I was very, I should say, thrilled and proud that mine was over 40%, and coming from have an indigenous people ancestry, and this would have been from Central America, specifically Mexico. And so, for me, it's just the people who created this land, who built this land, so that we are now able to enjoy.
And this is absolutely, to that point, there's been a lot of study of that, of the nature of our origins and what that all means, and the impact of the fact that the titles that we give were not the titles the indigenous people had. They were the people, and so to be able to acknowledge that and research that and be, we wouldn't presume to even speak, words that were on their behalf as much as are trying to understand, all right, and acknowledge who was here, and really correct history. And I found Princeton has always been, receptive to that kind of thing. Just kind of a little bit of a pseudo-intellectual community here, and we start digging a little deeper. And quite honestly, I mean, there's any number of organizations. Part of what we do at the Civil Rights Commission, there's always public comment, and folks come to us with various issues, things of that nature. But this is one that has consistently come up as to, I would like to be involved. Where do we go? And that's the formation of an ad hoc committee to kind of take advantage of the energy and the available resources that folks have already begun to look at, and make it have some meaning, so that it's not just words.
Yeah.
And I mean, Leticia points out in this period of time, and in these researches, not only some communities already within this country have begun to acknowledge and taken action. I mean, the one that comes to mind for me, Leticia, is the information we got from Australia, where nationally, any public forum, anything of that nature, they speak to the indigenous population and the true history, right? In way of giving praise and thanks.
Yeah, including, and I wanted to use this as an example. Well, first of all, let me say I was very impressed by the work that you've already done on land acknowledgement. And one of our commissioners has also done some research in that area. I believe you may have already, somebody from your school already spoke to her, Kim Dorman, when they were doing research.
Yes, at the Indigenous Peoples Conference.
Yes, so she's on this committee. She's one of our commissioners, and is on the committee to work on the initiative for Indigenous Peoples Day. But she pointed out something that I hadn't even noticed, and I think that most people don't either, was that what is the first thing that you see when you come to Princeton? What is the sign that you see announcing that you've arrived in Princeton? It's founded on, and then the date. But there were people here before that. I know the date, the year refers to, I believe, the first white person to have settled in Princeton. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was the first one here.
Right, absolutely.
So we need to find, we're looking to find the language that we could recommend that could go on that sign to acknowledge the people that's I would say cultivated this land, that made it possible for us to settle here.
So, what are some, do you think that there's like a stigma or some stereotypes that go around the idea of Indigenous people? And if so, how can we combat that, especially as people who may not be like a high percentage of Indigenous, especially to the land that we live on right now? How can we be allies and not overspeak or speak for the people?
Well, I would, just personally speaking, for myself, as I have been, but was that I would say mainly recognize that people are people with the same challenges. The same challenges we can say for immigrants, that there's stereotypes about immigrants. There's stereotypes about just about every type, everyone, whether it's Italian American, whether it's Irish. There's always been stereotypes. Right. And I would say the main thing to recognize is that people are people who are raising kids, trying to earn a living, and they're no different than us. So, yeah.
And it's also, in engaging in the truth. To the question you asked and the point Leticia made earlier, we're not here to presume to speak for the indigenous people. In fact, it's more to honor humanity, all right, and tell the truth about what was happening here. I always tell the story of my daughter. One of my daughters asked, she had to be about 5 or 6 years old. She said, "Well, how come they said Columbus discovered America when there were people waving at him when he got here? You know, those were the people. And for us to presume titles and the stereotypes that go along with that, that's what needs to be cleaned up. And you can't do that without some sort of engagement, communication, and relationship. The indigenous tribes of New Jersey were important to not only the state's ability to be sustained, all right, but those who came, all right, to be able to survive, and that needs to be dealt with. I know when I was in school, we used to spend a period of time on New Jersey history, and we talked a lot about the Revolution and the connections to the Princeton and the Revolution and folks that were there, but it was always kind of an in passing conversation. We had, doesn't take much for a person to kind of figure out, well, what was going on when folks showed up, and we need to deal with that openly, and hopefully our project will help do that.
Our initiative.
Absolutely, our initiative.
Well, that's beautiful, and we have confidence that it's definitely going to make a positive change. And I'm so happy that everybody's like, there's been no resistance to this, because this is what we need, the steps to move forward. And we're back, and now we have Dr. Sharma, a commissioner on the Princeton Civil Rights Commission. And just before this, we kind of went into a natural conversation about how the topic of Columbus and indigenous peoples was introduced to us in the school system, and we all kind of had a different perspective. So would you like to start explaining how it was introduced to you in your school systems?
Sure. So my perspective, I actually I was born and raised for the first 12 years of my life in Mexico. And so I went to school in Mexican school district, where we were taught, we did learn about Columbus, but I don't recall it being in the same light as it is here, as my kids were taught here. And it was more the same along the lines of Cortez conquering the Aztecs, and so it wasn't seen in he wasn't seen in a positive light.
Yeah.
So he wasn't told about in a positive light, from what I remember. And so it just, for me, it highlights the importance of being able to tell the story from the perhaps different perspectives. Because if you're only hearing one way, that is told one way, that's the only impression you're going to have. And so for me, even going forward with, as we advocate for the recognition and celebration of indigenous people, is that, especially in our school system, that we tell their stories from their perspective.
Yeah.
So
very good.
That was amazing.
Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate that. And my recollection of being a student in India was Columbus was actually looking for India to have a trade between India and the Europe, and I think he ended up in South America. And so when he first discovered that, he thought he arrived in India, but wasn't the case. So anyhow, so the understanding or the teaching that we had was that, well, later on he discovered America, and that's not true. And history, as we know now, which is not true, is that he was not the discoverer of Americas. The indigenous people were already here. They are the original people. And from history, we have to learn. If our ancestors made mistakes, we need to correct them. And how we correct them is the way we are trying to do now, is recognize that who they were the original people here, and how much they contributed. And we talk about, for example, environment now. They were so proactive about the environment. They were far ahead of us even today. They cared for the air, they cared for the water, they cared for the land, and they had developed many medicines which were not only good for them but also indigenous people, like that we are actually learning from those things right now. So they were the original people who were here. So Columbus, I'm sorry to say, was not the discoverer of Americas. So.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how you were taught in your school, but in my school, it was kind of two-sided in a way, because I remember in second grade we had this big unit on Native Americans, and they told us that, there was like this misconception, like that they were called Indians because he was searching for India. Then it started that whole stereotype and that odd name. And I remember all of that, but then still celebrating Columbus Day. So I was like, what's going on here? I don't think that Columbus Day is as celebrated now, like in the lower school. I think that we're finally like moving out of that direction, which is really great. But still, when I was younger, we were still celebrating Columbus Day. What about you?
I forgot what we did. I just knew we had a day off from school. That was all I cared about.
So, I wanted to point out, I meant to bring it up earlier in the discussion. So as we discuss an initiative to establish Indigenous Peoples Day, I know there's a misconception that the municipality is looking at replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, but I wanted to clarify that actually the municipality does not observe Columbus Day. There's no celebration of it. Our municipal staff still go to work, offices are open, and from what I understand, even the school district, even though on the calendar it says Columbus Day, and the kids, at least our students in the Princeton School District, may have a day off, it's not for Columbus Day. It's a staff development day. But as far as addressing it, I personally am interested in encouraging the school district to observe it. So even on their calendar. So instead of to put Indigenous, whatever day we settle on, to put it on their calendar, Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah.
So what kind of curriculum changes do you think should be made in this kind of aspect, like about Columbus and Indigenous people? How do you think it should change? Or if you think it's good now?
Well, I don't, I have not a school here, but so I don't know if it's observed or celebrated.
I think from the curriculum perspective, the truths need to be told. And the way to do is to do the research, exactly find the facts, because we can't go from here, say, oh, we don't like this, or we don't. Everything has to be based on research. And scholars are now getting into that, what really is the truth. Once that is established, then all the textbooks and all the curriculum and all the teachings, remember the teachers that lied to me, all those lies that told, is one of them, that, Columbus discovered America. Not true. So there are many things that we need to, however, it takes time. And the time is important because you don't want to rush into something without facts. And that's research always gives you the facts. And that's where we are now. And you can see, like in many states and many cities, they are now passing resolutions that Indigenous Peoples' Day should be observed because they were here before Columbus came. So we need to kind of have those textbook revised based on those facts. So we also need to acknowledge their contribution, the diversity that they're bringing. All that need to be, instead of stereotyping them, we need to encourage them and treat them equally and make sure they also keep their culture, their heritage, their roots, because that's who they are, because they were there long before. And even though we believe in science and everything, which is true, but science is developed many different ways. They observed nature for a long, long period, and based on the observation, they made some conclusions that, hey, we need to take care of our air, we need to take care of our water, we need to take care of our land, we need to take care of the animals, and all that is also, if you look at, they were scientists in a way. And science now is being recognizing all these things that they did all the important thing that we are now learning, they already did that. So we need to recognize that, and we need to kind of make sure all those their contributions are truly and without any of observations or whatever. We need to make sure that the coming generations knows the facts, and as I said, and that will be done, and that's what the council is planning to do in coming months or coming years, is based on that facts that we are trying to recognize that. So that's kind of like what we want you to know, that we are very proud of Council Fraga, who is actually, spearheading it, and there are many very well-known community people, including Daniel Harris and others, who are spearheading this effort. So we appreciate that, and we also appreciate your efforts, bringing up this subject, which is so important to talk about. So
Definitely, especially with, given that it is so important for your generation to do perhaps the work that has been overlooked, that we should have addressed long ago.
Yeah.
And especially, if I can mention, especially given today's political environment, and specifically with anti-immigrant talk, saying, everybody except for Native Americans were the ones that were here. If you start saying someone doesn't belong because they came from a different country, I need to point out to you. I need to point out to you. Yes.
So true.
All of us sitting here.
All of us, yes. Yeah. So true.
What do you think? I mean, there's like the topic of apologizing for the past, but there's nothing that you can really adequately do or say that can make up for the atrocities that the indigenous people face. They were attached to land, they knew the lay of the land better than any of us will ever know, and they were forced off of their home. So what do you think? I mean, obviously we can never fully apologize for what happened, but what do you think would be an adequate measure?
Well, can I say,
Sure.
well, first of all, I would not even attempt to speak for the people, for indigenous people. But I would say the first step is they have to be at the table.
Yeah.
When we're talking about it. So I'm not going to speak for them. They have to be at the table. But most definitely, it's also important that we do have that conversation, and we continue to have those conversations. Because to say, well, it's in the past, is over and done with, it's not. We have to acknowledge, and we have to have the dialogue. That's the first step. And they have to be at the table.
Sure. And I think like the real process started in mid-80s, that when United Nations started to talk about it. And finally, after a couple of decades, they passed a resolution, I believe on September 13, 2007, declaring United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that was, I will say, a very important day for acknowledging all the countries in the world, saying, hey, we understand it, they have rights, they're equal, and they have special thing on top of that. And asked all countries to observe the declaration and making sure that their rights and their values and their all their observances are treated, and they are free to exercise them. And as far as treating that, the land was taken and all that, I think no money can really compensate that. Just the acknowledgement is the starting point, that, hey, there were some atrocities made, and there were some killings done, and all these things were done. The land was taken without proper compensation, and so on and so forth. As I said, it's not just the money, it's the acknowledgement, which is the most important thing. It's the human rights, it's the civil rights, it's the values of dignity, their diversity that they bring. That's what we need to acknowledge to start with. As Councilperson Fraga said, let's talk about it. let's bring to the table. Let's not have a stereotype about them. We need to kind of really sit down and become one. We are one humanity. We need to love each other. We can't survive without each other. And if we kind of keep on talking about, well, I don't want to share my privileges because I earned it or whatever, earned on based on what basis? We need to acknowledge that. We need to share. That's kind of like where we need to go. And there will be a lot of positive outcomes will come if we all talk about it. And we need to understand and share other people's feelings too, because there are always, some people may think differently, and we need to listen to them as well. So I think starting the positive dialogue is the most important thing. Acknowledgement is the key.
I just want to make one
Sure.
last point, that we're talking about it as if, acknowledge as if this is something that is in the past, atrocities that have happened in the past, but it's still ongoing. We
Sure.
have we not heard about lands that are, there's drilling being allowed on places that were supposed to be
Yeah.
tribal lands.
So true.
So it's still ongoing.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the new curriculum and acknowledgement, a former teacher at my school started a class called Multicultural America, and this year she started it with the indigenous people, and that's how we learned about their side of history. And she told us about land acknowledgement, that I think the Canadians originally started it, where they acknowledged the land that they were on for the indigenous people, after the Pledge of Allegiance. And some people, there's been a little resistance to it, because while it's good to acknowledge, some people feel like it starts to get becomes the new normal, and no one really thinks about it anymore. Like no one thinks about the Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
So do you think, is it worth to have the land acknowledgement, or should there be a curriculum to supplement it?
Why not all?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, not only we need to acknowledge, and that's what their starting point is, that, hey, at least acknowledge that you took this, our land. At least acknowledge that you're not supposed to have a, pipeline on our sacred places, for example. And then once those are done, curriculum changes are easier, because they had to be based on the facts, based on the research, and based on the scholars. Those kind of can be implemented, will be done. And I think even though not changing the subject, only this recently, Georgetown University acknowledged that, they used to own slaves, and now they're acknowledging that they made a mistake. So I think those are precedents being set up. So there need to be done the similar way for the indigenous people, that we need to acknowledge their contribution, their heritage, their culture, and what they did. They were here before us. They are the original people. They are the people that we should be thankful for. And so I think talking about the textbooks and curriculum, that will follow. And I see it coming not in distant future. And so we are very positive. I think having these kind of forums and having these kind of discussions are very important, so we can let the public know. And that's what UNO is trying to say. Hey guys, we passed the resolution. What good is that if we are not communicating to the indigenous people and to the public? And so our role, all of our collective role, is to let the public know what the facts are and what we need to do, and what history tells us, and how we can learn from it and move on. So I think we are on the right path, but every path is not simple. And we need to kind of be aware of that too. And I think we should stay positive. And younger generation like you, we are going to be counting on you, that you take the mantle and move on. And I think that we really appreciate that, what you are doing and what your efforts are. So we thank you for that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this. And I think this is a good note, since
Yes.
we're out of time to finish. And I'd just like to say thank you so much
No,
for
thank you.
imparting your wisdom and coming and spending time talking to us.
So where can an audience contact you?
Or find more information.
Well, there's the municipal website that has for my on council my personal information, and you'll find even I list my phone number on there as well. But for the Civil Rights Commission, if you go to the web page, there's information there on the work of the commission, and also encourage any interested individuals to come to the meetings. They're open to the public. So that's another way to participate.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you, Councilperson Fraga.
Thank you
Great
very
job.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.